All right, hello everyone, and welcome to this plenary session on reimagining the university in an era of polycrisis. My name is Kyla Tienhaara, and I'm a Canada Research Chair in Economy and Environment at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, which is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee. I'm very excited to be moderating this session, which I have also organized. To start, I just wanted to briefly give you a bit of a sense for why I wanted to have this session, given that it's a topic that I don't actually do research on myself. So I consider myself a scholar activist, and since joining the faculty at Queen's University 6 years ago, I have been working with colleagues and student organizers to try to get the university to divest its endowment from fossil fuels. I've also been collaborating with colleagues at the University of Toronto, Guelph University, and Trent to try to get our joint pension plan divested. I would like to say that we've had great success in these endeavors, but unfortunately, we have not. We have certainly made some important inroads on the pension plan, but Queen's endowment remains invested in carbon majors and companies involved in extraction in the Canadian tar sands, as well as companies building oil and gas pipelines across Indigenous territories without free, prior, and informed consent. And unfortunately, at the moment, it seems especially difficult to mobilize people on climate issues on campus. One of the reasons is, I guess, the theme of this conference. We are dealing with a polycrisis, so there's many things pulling at our attention. Another sort of micro reason is that we're having to fight a lot of other battles locally, for example, against austerity measures imposed by the senior administration to deal with financial pressures. And I'm absolutely sure that this is not a situation that is unique to Queen's. I know colleagues all around the world are facing similar struggles at the moment. Another issue is that there are measures being taken at my university and many other universities to severely restrict the right to peacefully protest and demonstrate, so much so that the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Freedom of Assembly and Association, Gina Romero, felt the need to issue a statement a few weeks ago reminding universities of their obligations to uphold basic human rights. So all of this has left me a bit disheartened and struggling to know what to do next. But rather than give up, I thought maybe I could find some people who have done research on climate justice efforts at universities and who have had successes that I could learn from, and I could bring them together to talk about their insights and experiences. And so that is how this event came about. So let me now introduce you to our excellent panel. Our first speaker is a feminist, climate justice scholar, activist, writer, and social justice advocate, Jennie Stephens. She is Professor of Climate Justice at the Icarus Climate Research Centre at the National University of Ireland, Maynooth. Before joining Maynooth, she was a Climate Justice Fellow at Harvard Radcliffe, faculty at Northeastern University, the University of Vermont, and Clark University. Today, she's going to talk about her forthcoming book, Climate Justice and the University, Shaping a Hopeful Future for All, which will be published by Johns Hopkins University Press in December. I am so excited to read this book, and it is a great privilege to be getting a preview of it today. Our second speaker, Philipp Pattberg, is a professor of transnational environmental governance and policy and the head of the Department for Environmental Policy Analysis at the Science Faculty, VU Amsterdam. Many of you will be familiar with Philipp's research. He's been involved with the ESG project since it was first initiated. But what I've asked Philipp to speak about today is his involvement in a successful campaign to have VU Amsterdam commit to a fossil-free research framework. Finally, we'll hear from Maddie Young and Will Kattrup. Maddie is a student organizer from Evanston, Illinois. Together with other students at American University, she launched and led a campaign for a Green New Deal at American University. Will was born and raised in Denmark, and he is a student at Brown University, where he has led multiple research projects on fossil fuel-sponsored climate misinformation. And both Maddie and Will are research managers within the Campus Climate Network, which is a coalition of student-led climate justice groups fighting to have universities cut ties with the fossil fuel industry and its enablers. Just a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over. I would point you all to the Q&A function in Zoom. Please feel free to put questions in there as we go. We will save the Q&A until we've heard from all of the speakers, but you don't have to wait until the end to put your questions in, and I will do my best to make sure that we get through all of them. So with that, I will turn it over to Professor Stephens.
Great. Well, thank you, Kyla. It's great to be here. And I think what I want to start by just saying is that I think our higher education systems and our higher education institutions are a key part of Earth system governance. We don't always think of them in that way as part of our governance structure, but they are critical organizations that give legitimacy to certain kinds of discourses, certain kinds of policies, certain kinds of technologies. So I think it's appropriate and great to be part of this conference and part of this discussion, bringing the role of universities to the fore. So I want to start, I guess, by let me see here. The theme of the conference and the thing that many of us are thinking about is this polycrisis, this moment we're in where we have health crises, mental health crises, food, energy, cost of living, housing crises in many places around the world. We have financial crises and economic crises, biodiversity crisis, plastic pollution crisis. And we have a crisis in militarization and war. And right now we have the failure of international law, upholding the international law. And then on top of that, we have the climate crisis, which is basically exacerbating everything and contributing to a lot of these intersecting crises. So, the question many of us ask is like, why are we in this place of intersecting crises, and why have we been so ineffective over the past decades in responding to these, despite all that we know about what's causing the crises? So I want to put forward that our higher education institutions are critical organizations in how we think about knowledge, wealth, and power, and how they're interconnected. And we often think about knowledge as unbiased, apolitical, and often that's what our universities kind of promote, the idea that knowledge is, open for us all to explore and different. Yet I think we don't fully understand and analyze how the knowledge that is generated and disseminated in our higher education institutions is actually quite integrally linked to power structures and financial interests in society. So what I've done in my forthcoming book is kind of try to connect some dots here so that we can reclaim our universities for the public good, and to address the kinds of changes, societal changes that are possible, if we weren't beholden to this concentration of wealth and power trying to influence so much how our universities and knowledge production and knowledge dissemination is prioritized. So I think this framework of knowledge, wealth, and power is just a helpful way to think about our higher education systems, and hopefully we can explore that a little bit here as to why. So I've been working in higher ed myself my whole career, so 30 years or so. And I think I just want to acknowledge and reflect, and some of what I do in the book is actually share my own experience. So my first faculty position I started in 2005, which was right when Hurricane Katrina hit. I was at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. And there, at that time, I was in an idealistic department called International Development, Community, and Environment. And we were trying to figure out how can we leverage our higher education resources to help and prevent future destruction and death and suffering that we saw in Hurricane Katrina. And I think at that time, I think I was more optimistic and thought that, you know, the horrors that were experienced, you know, could mobilize change. Here we are, you know, almost 20 years later, and we're seeing more and worse and more intense disruptions of all kinds, including intensification of hurricanes. And so the question grappling with is like, you know, why is it that we aren't more able to contribute to more transformative change? And I bring us back to this year, where we see campuses around the world, you know, resisting and calling for human rights and humanity, and thinking about and seeing the powerful interests that are shutting down protests, and then universities themselves being destroyed in Gaza, for example, and so many other. And so the question then comes is, why is it and how is it that, and what is the role in our universities, kind of just saying, oh, this is the way it is, we have to accept some things, like, and this is where I bring in this idea of complacency that is sometimes encouraged to just this is the way the world is, and kind of encourage people to not be outraged or protesting or bringing their concerns about what's happening in the world to our campuses. And it's a very obviously tense time right now. And what I have tried to do is really kind of think about the power of higher education institutions and question why it is that they have not been, and we are not able in our higher education institutions to have as much, to leverage that power toward the changes that the science and a lot of our research tells us need to happen. And so I bring also this framework of resist, reclaim, and restructure. And this is a framework that's used in the energy democracy space. But I think applying it to thinking about higher education is helpful. And I propose that we should be thinking about resisting the academic capture. Like, we can see these powerful interests and private sector interests and corporatized interests dominating and influencing our higher education institutions in ways that many of us don't even realize how powerful and how influential the academic, the corporatized partnerships are to what's happening on our campuses. And we really need to, you know, call to reclaim higher ed for the public good. Higher ed is thought of in general as having a public good mission, not a private sector mission. And therefore it should be based on what's best for the public good. And then I propose that you know, we really need to restructure our higher education system for this to happen, because if we keep doing the same and tinkering around the edges here and there, it's not really going to result in much different outcomes. So I propose this new vision, an imaginary vision of a climate justice university, which is a whole different kind of university than our current universities. So we can talk in the discussion about, you know, trying to change the current institutions that many of us are affiliated with, and how that can be very frustrating. And I've had, you know, decades of experience with that. But I think also, I argue that we need bigger imagination. Like, we actually have to let go of some of our assumptions about higher ed. And that, when we talk about more transformative change, you know, requires some disruption and something actually quite different than what we're currently doing. So what I've done is try to imagine, really kind of reimagine what our higher education system could be doing, and what kind of impact we could be having if we were committed to a climate just future. So let's see. So this work really, I want to situate it within critical university studies. This is a new emerging field that is actually quite reflective and questioning some of the things that are done in higher education. Higher education benefits from a very positive image that almost everything we do in higher ed is great, right? And yet there is this emerging scholarship that really points out a lot of the troubling and harmful and unjust things that happen in higher education. So within the book, I tried to consolidate all the critique in the one chapter so that we can focus on the positive reimagining potential. And among the things that I talk about are the patriarchy, misogyny, and gender violence that's prevalent in higher ed, the structural racism that is perpetuated, and so many efforts to diversify are really just performative and actually reinforce and exacerbate racial inequities. The capitalist corporatization and financialization, this idea of the academic industrial complex, right, of these universities just creating this whole new economic network that is corporatized and integrally linked with private sector interests. The coloniality of academia in terms of often very specific preferencing certain kinds of knowledge, particularly Western European knowledge, and dismissing and disregarding other kinds of knowledge. So this epistemic injustices that are so I just want to mention all of that and not dwell on that. But I just want to point out that this work is really situated in this critical university studies area. And the potential is to center justice with kind of a feminist, anti-colonial, anti-racist, power focus, like understanding the power dynamics is what I refer to when I talk about feminist or anti-colonial or anti-racist, like thinking about and acknowledging how legacy and current power dynamics are being either reinforced or disrupted in our system. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to either resist those or reinforce them. And I argue that many of the things we do in our higher education systems are actually reinforcing rather than resisting so many of these injustices. So what I propose is climate justice as a paradigm shift. I mean, the word climate justice is used quite a lot, and it has many different definitions and meanings to different folks. But I think for me and for many people, it's really about transformation, and it's about moving away from a narrow way of thinking about the climate crisis as all about decarbonization and greenhouse gas emission reductions and individual behavior change and technological change that will somehow, reduce some of those emissions, which is the dominant way we think about the climate crisis in our universities and in society. But instead shifting from that paradigm to a more transformative paradigm, which is the climate justice paradigm, which is really transformative, talking about how we really need big social, economic change, political change, so that we aren't continuing to perpetuate the injustices, the wealth and concentration of wealth and power, so that we are moving toward collective action, well-being priorities for everyone, sufficiency mindset rather than wealth accumulation mindset, exnovation instead of innovation, and I'll talk more about that, but that's the idea. Innovation is all about generating new ideas and new technologies, new practices, new ways of doing things. Exnovation is about letting go and stopping doing the things that we know are causing harm, yet we really need to, but we often don't pay a lot of attention to how to do that exnovation piece. So that's why I focused in this thinking about climate justice universities. Like, what if our universities were focused on a better future for all, and how could they be engaged in this transformative climate justice shift? So the way I suggest we think about this is to, come back to this knowledge, wealth, power diagram that I showed at the beginning. And I kind of, in the book, kind of look at a chapter on each of these themes, teaching and research, 2 different chapters there that are both about knowledge dissemination, which is the teaching bit, and knowledge creation or co-creation, which is the research piece. Then I have there's a whole chapter on financialization of higher ed and the financial flows, and that speaks to the wealth component of this triangle. And then there's a whole section on community engagement, different kinds of partnerships and relationships and distribution of higher education institutions, and how they could be more community focused on what the public needs rather than kind of these power relationships. So briefly, what I'm going to do is just go through some of the highlights from each of these different sections, and then we can open it up to broader discussion and the other panelists as well. So the first concept in the teaching section is this idea of unlearning. And I suggest that there's so many things that we're teaching people in our higher education institutions that are actually contrary and counter to a climate just future. And so this idea of unlearning, how do we stop perpetuating frameworks, narratives, theories that are really disconnected from the reality of the polycrisis? And so in specific in this area is like unlearning neoliberal economics, right? We teach students that growth is perpetual and market-based, market fundamentalism is the dominant, maybe the only, some people are taught this is the only way economic systems could be, structured, when in fact, there's a huge diversity of ways that our economic systems could be structured. And so there's the solidarity economy, there's donut economics, there's feminist economics, there's degrowth, all kinds of post-growth and degrowth ways of thinking about the world, and that in economic systems that actually acknowledge the planetary boundaries, right? And I quote here Michael D. Higgins, who's the president of Ireland, when he recently said in his speech he gave that our failure to facilitate a pluralism of approaches in teaching economics is a deprivation of basic students' rights, indeed citizen rights, leading to a narrow, blinkered, and distorted education. So, economics is so central to our policymaking, to the way people are thinking about the world, and mainstream neoliberal economics doesn't acknowledge the polycrises and the planetary boundaries and all of the things that in a way that makes sense to people. And I think it's really leading to cognitive dissonance among so many people and students and more. So I think this is one area of unlearning that I think is really important to discuss. Also, I think it's important to acknowledge, unlearning some of these knowledge hierarchies that are perpetuated in higher education. We really, in our universities, we don't teach much about relational knowledge, how we're connected with each other to the non-human world. We don't teach much or give much respect to embodied knowledge, how our bodies tell us things about what's happening in the world. And also local knowledge, right? Like there's so much kind of centralized, this is what you should be learning in university, that a lot of times local knowledge is also, disrespected and not given a space in our university education. So, so that's kind of like some highlights from the teaching section. Then there's a whole chapter on research. And in research, the big concept that I focus on is exnovation. And I mentioned this briefly already. So much of our universities and our research is about innovation. The idea is you come up with something new, and then the assumption is that the new will displace the old, right? So you don't have to worry about exnovating away from the old thing. But what we're seeing in the world, and particularly in the energy systems, we've come up with renewable energy systems and renewable energy technologies. And the assumption is will just deploy all this renewable energy, and the fossil fuel infrastructure and the fossil fuel reliance will decline. Whereas in fact, after 30 years of this happening, we see right now that fossil fuel extraction is higher than ever. And the fossil fuel companies are making higher profits than they ever have before. So we are not in a fossil fuel phase out mode yet, right? Despite all the science. And I think a lot of that, I would argue, is because we have not been doing ex-novation research on how to phase out fossil fuels. And part of the reason for that, so many of our universities' climate energy centers are actually funded by fossil fuel interests. So they are encouraging carbon capture and storage research, fracking research, all these fossil fuel friendly kinds of climate energy research, and not fossil fuel phase out. So I think this focus on ex-novation is really critical. We've kind of doing ourselves a disservice to always just assume that innovation will displace things. Plastics is another big area. We have all this research showing that plastics are pervasive. They're in our bloodstream. They're throughout our oceans. They're even in babies' breast milk that babies are drinking, right? Microplastics. Yet we don't have research on how to stop using plastics. Like, we have very little. It just keeps going. And why is that? Is it because of the private sector interests who are influencing our research agendas? That's, I think, a big question. Why don't we have a huge effort to try to ex-novate away from plastics as well as fossil fuels? So those are some of the ideas in the research section. Then there's a whole chapter on wealth and financial flows in universities, and this is an area that many of us have experienced parts of the financialization of our universities that we're associated or affiliated with. But again, we don't necessarily have a comprehensive picture of what's going on and why the money is mattering, is having such a big influence. So this is a figure from the book that talks about why and how our universities have become so financialized. And the core of it is reduced public spending, right? So that then universities are forced to, in our current systems, look for other revenue. And a lot of it is universities then become investors or hedge funds or real estate developers, right? As part of their financial, taking care of their own financial well-being. We also see the commodification of knowledge and this whole focus on revenue maximization, and which has all kinds of impacts on what we do, how the universities operate, and how we can engage in work for the public good. We have increasingly overworked and precarious workers and overstretched staff. We have a huge corporate influence on our curriculum, on our research agendas, on how we engage. And then the students themselves are often seen now as customers rather than students, and there's all kinds of stress and angst associated with, on the student side, with the high cost and all these implications. So if we think about wealth and the need for kind of reparative finance, and we need to be thinking about ways, if we want a better future for all, we need to move away from this concentration of wealth and power and move toward distributing wealth and power in new and different ways. I think some of the ideas that we could really be exploring more in our universities is public ownership, cooperative model of organizations and even of the universities themselves, these ideas of debt-free access for all, and thinking about investing in communities in different ways. Like, how could universities, and how could they be more involved in kind of community wealth building and different models for more distributive financial contributions that our higher education organizations could be part of. So the final section is about kind of power and relationships, and this kind of speaks to kind of community engagement as well, and how can we envision higher education institutions having more of a kind of impact by being more accessible and localized in a way, yet also having, you know, teaching and facilitating global solidarity as well as local. So in this section, there are multiple different ideas about thinking about higher education institutions. Vandana Shiva has talked about grandmothers' universities so that local knowledge never disappears, which is thinking about this idea of smaller, localized institutions where people can share their local knowledge. There's the Ecoversities Alliance, which is a global network of organizations and initiatives that are really thinking about higher education and educational institutions that are much more connected with what community needs. And one idea that I put forth in the book is, what if we think about higher education institutions more like the public library, right? That every community has some access to a higher education institution in some way, whether it be a localized branch or you know, could we move away from this model of these elite concentrated organizations in urban centers to kind of really geographically spreading out universities in different ways so that communities have more access, especially in a world with increasing climate disruptions of all kinds, where people need resources and help and co-creation of strategies of how to respond to the world. You know, how could our universities be restructured in that vein? So I think here, and I know we're going to hear more from others who are involved in, you know, some of these other alternative initiatives to try to get research to be fossil free, to make our universities more people powered, and thinking about the People's University. There's these Beyond the Academy and Scientist Rebellion, people within organizations who are, you know, trying to resist and reclaim the public good mission of higher ed. And then there's research that, like what was just published, I'm a co-author on this paper, Fossil Fuel Industry Influence in Higher Education, from just last month, this open access article. And what we found, we did a review, and we found that the influence for decades, fossil fuel industry has very strategically been using or leveraging higher education to, as part of their climate obstruction efforts, to, you know, you know, shy away from any talk of fossil fuel phase out and promote all these non-transformative technological fixes to the climate change, and promote ideas that are not transformative in any way. So I'd be happy to talk more about that if anyone's interested. So I think those are the kind of the main ideas that I'd like to share. And I think the idea of climate justice universities as like an imaginary thing that we could work toward is, you know, for me, some of the key things are this kind of, can we, instead of concentrating wealth and power, how could our universities actually be part of distributing wealth and power, or transformative thinking that would move society toward that, and that for me is integrally linked to fossil fuels and the phase out of fossil fuels, because what my own research has shown is that the power of the fossil fuel industry and the fossil fuel companies and individuals and organizations and countries that rely on fossil fuels are really been resisting what the science tells us is needed for so long, that we really need to break that pattern and cycle if we want to reclaim our universities. So I will stop there and just mention that the book is available for pre-order, and it will be available, actually published on December 10th. And I also mentioned this new initiative that is in parallel, which is an action-oriented collective action initiative called Climate Justice Universities Union. And we are individuals from different universities. It was started here in Ireland, where I am. But we welcome membership from people all around the world. And the idea with the Climate Justice Universities Union is to share resources, provide support for people, collaborate, get involved in collective action, actually advocate to policymakers to rethink what the potential of higher education could be if it was publicly invested in new and different ways. So I welcome people to check out our website for the Climate Justice Universities Union, and look forward to the discussion and hearing from the other panelists. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. There's so much in there to unpack, and I'm already feeling more optimistic about the future, even if it's an imaginary. I just think there's so many great ideas there. Just a reminder to everyone that feel free to put questions into that Q&A function, and I will now turn it over to Professor Philipp Pattberg.
Yeah, thanks so much for organizing this panel. It's a great pleasure to be here today with you and to discuss this important question. I also want to say, Jenny, I was also inspired by your talk. Some of the things you mentioned definitely resonate with my own experience. Maybe I was in parts also very lucky, because for most of the journey I will describe in a second, all things went as well as they probably could have, which is sometimes just the luck that you need to get things done. But I try to make it a bit more systematic, although my story is not a scientific story in a sense. This is N1, this is my own very personal experience. All of this is owed to many, many people that I'm not able to name in full, but I just want to make very clear that this is a community effort. This is not an effort by individual people, although individuals and in the end also our board took a decision, but it's actually really an embodiment of the idea of a community that came to the fore here. And that's of course important to know that communities, whatever type you envisage, don't always agree, but they can find certain mechanisms of agreeing and moving forward. And I think that's the story I want to tell. So, and all of this in 9 minutes, but that's pretty challenging. So I have broken this down in various steps. So my university, the Vrije Universiteit in Dutch of Amsterdam, has taken a decision. The decision was officially announced in 2023, decision to stop or enter into no further new collaboration with fossil fuel industry on research, unless these industries, these companies could show a meaningful engagement with the Paris target, so the 1.5 to 2 degree target of the Paris Agreement. And then, of course, I will tell you a little bit how we measure that and how we can know whether they actually do that. But that was sort of the decision that was taken, no further research. It's not about teaching. It's not about having a guest speaker or so. So there are other forms of engagement of the fossil fuel industry that are still possible. Maybe something we can also talk about why this is the case. But basically, how did it start? And I think that's one of the really interesting points that I want to make. It started by the agency of activists. It started by some colleagues organized in such groups as Scientist Rebellion, but others as well, and students demanding that the university would take action, that the university would, first of all, tell the broader public what they were doing. So there was a transparency issue here, that no one actually knew exactly how many research collaborations we had. Yeah, you just also mentioned, Jenny, the research that has to be done. We don't have a full picture of that. There isn't anyone within the university, at least at the VU, who you could just ask and say, okay, so how many? Like, no one knew that. So we would have to look into that. And that start was really driven by these activists and a collaboration between science activists, so colleagues who were seeing science and activism not as oppositions, but as something that you can meaningfully do together, and students who were interested in this from a very personal perspective. So one anecdote I still remember is that students reported to be puzzled by the fact that Shell would be at a career fair and talk about future jobs when some of the students commented that it's actually the future that Shell is destroying. So talking about future jobs would be a very weird, naive thing to do. And from that sort of intervention came a larger discussion what the role of companies is in supporting study programs, in giving guest lectures, giving career advice, and so on. And from that discussion, a broader discussion ensued about what actually is the relationship between the university, FU, and the fossil fuel industry. And just for transparency, it took us a while to actually have a definition of what the fossil fuel industry is. And you probably know there are many, many different definitions, broad, narrow. So we took a sort of narrow one. Some people rightfully argue that plastic companies are also fossil fuel industries, but that would be a broad definition. So here we took a bit of a narrow definition, and I could point you to where that is referenced, but basically telling you that this wasn't clear to us in the beginning. So this is also a search process. What are we actually talking about? What is research collaboration? What is a fossil fuel company? How do we actually show commitment to the Paris Agreement? And so on and so on, all really interesting things I will try to touch super briefly. So the first step was the student engagement and the activism by colleagues. Now, how did we as a community react? And I think that's really one of those important trajectories, basically, where things can go really wrong. One reaction that you could think about is that the management, the higher ups, would block this. And they would say, no, we don't want to have a discussion on that. This is just as it always was, and we just continue. That was not the case at the FU. And one of my guesses is that's because our history and our identity as a university is very much based on values, on critical thinking, on the right to be free. So it came as a sort of natural reaction to engage in discussion and to really say, we don't really know exactly what we do, but to take this serious and to allow all the voices to be heard was sort of inbuilt, I would say, to some degree into the DNA of the academic community, which makes it much easier to have these contested debates. So that was a step we took. And that was basically organized in the sense that different stakeholders, different departments, faculties, and some of the support staff could write position papers on how they were thinking about this collaboration with the fossil fuel industry. And based on those inputs, we had rounds of discussions and meetings in which we try to work towards some of those arguments and come to, some sort of consensus. In the end, it is the board that took the decision, but the board, I think, took the decision because they felt that a consensus was reached. There was opposition. There were colleagues who very, very strongly opposed the decision that we took. But also, I think what we managed was a respectful way to still keep them engaged, to have people still informed, although we knew they were not in favor of that decision, keep them at least part of the process. So once that decision was reached, it made quite a splash, let's say, at least in the Netherlands. And so I think we were the second university worldwide to actually take such a decision, although it's really not about shoulder clapping or, rankings and stuff, but it's really saying that we were early in the curve. Well, we soon realized that many of our peers in the Netherlands were struggling with similar requests from students and colleagues, and also similar problems, how to measure, how to define. So we thought actually the next step, and that is the third building block of my story, was to have an internal discussion with other actors, with the larger stakeholder community. First of all, we had a meeting with other universities, and then we had a meeting with the industry and representatives of civil society. Those were close meetings. They were not public. They were meetings where we basically had Chatham House rules and we discussed really difficult questions. And we invited actually Shell to one of those meetings, and it was fascinating to hear what they had to say. And I think I'm not telling anything too confidential when I say they have a pretty good PR talk, and then they move out, and the next day they announced that they basically scrapped their entire renewable energy investments, which didn't surprise me as an academic. I worked on some of these issues, but was a bit surprising to some of my colleagues who were not in the field per se. So in a sense, it was also very illuminating. Those internal discussions, however, also enabled us to gauge support in the broader network. So we understood quickly that we are not alone in this. Other universities have not only similar interests in a sense, but they also struggle with similar challenges. How to define, how to know, how to balance the different interests. And so we felt that actually as a community, and there are only 13 or so universities in the Netherlands, this works even better. So we can take it to a higher level. Now, what we didn't achieve is a universal, let's say, position of all universities, which would have been nice maybe, but actually what we achieved is an understanding and a recognition that we also have our differences as institutions. And let me just super briefly explain that. And I think it has to do a lot with what Jennie was outlining. Some universities have a different interest structure just because they cater to different clients. So when you may be a more technical university and you work more with some of those companies that need your brain cells to actually dig deeper and get more out of it, you might be more vulnerable than if you're a university that is far removed from any technical application, right? And just make this up now, but basically saying that universities are not the same, and so they have different structures within. So we realized that quickly that we couldn't push too hard, but what we could do is keep this debate going so that universities could learn from each other and maybe, cut and paste some of the good ideas. All right, we then developed an actual framework, and I'm happy to put it in the chat or somewhere else. You can just look at it, which is basically the framework that we now use to actually analyze any new research project that might involve fossil fuel industry. And there's a committee that handles this and that gives an advice to our board, and then a decision is taken. And I think we have now a first case in discussion, but I cannot tell you about it. But we have a framework that we use along which we actually assess concrete cases. Now, the last part of our journey was that we quickly realized that actually sharing our lessons would be probably the biggest impact we could have. So it's not about the food, it's not about being right or looking good, and it's maybe for some, but actually within this broader community, very early on, I felt a commitment to sharing what we had achieved, but also what we didn't achieve. Because it's important to realize that this is a little win. It looks good, it looks big, but it's a little win, it's a necessary one, but we are not stopping here. We are using this platform and we're using the knowledge for other difficult discussions. And I'm not saying that this is a blueprint for every type of problem that you might encounter, but I think it holds for many wicked sort of polycrisis type of engagements that we might want to discuss as a university. So what are the lessons learned then? It's my final input for today that I want to share. The first one is, it is a community effort. In the end, if the university is divided, then it's hard to move ahead. I think that's, you're saying, you're naive. Of course you're divided and there are different interests and there's powers, I know. But the feeling of community, an academic community, including the students, including support staff, makes you much, much stronger than even the most dedicated small group of just scientists who keep on saying, I told you so, it's in my paper, just read it, it's the science. That didn't really work. What worked is to listen to the others, to try to understand what their problem was with some of these discussions. First. Second, right from the beginning, people said academic freedom. You can't do anything. We just have academic freedom. We can do whatever we want. And it was very important, very early, that some of our managers, our board said, that's not true. There's no total academic freedom. You can do whatever you want in research. And we all agree there are, of course, ethical standards that we need to adhere to. And not going to discuss if we always find the right format and formative thinking, but I think we agree that you can't just go out there and do research on people in any way you want. This is totally uncontested. So why would you be, calling academic freedom as a carte blanche to do research with destructive interests? And that was very helpful. Another point I want to mention is that we based our discussions and our decisions on the idea of scientific integrity. The weird thing is that you were basically discussing with scientists whose research was on how fossil fuel industry was destroying the planet, lying to us, and doing this all over again according to a script that is well established and has been used, for example, in the tobacco, cancer, and smoking case. And they were actually literally writing articles about that, and then had to convince people that they weren't making it up. But this is based on good science. And I think it's important to realize that if you agree that partially, our academic endeavor is about finding an approximation to some form of truth, and we can discuss, whatever epistemology you have. But if you agree with that a little bit, we're looking for some form of bounded truth. Then, of course, you need to take research serious in some way, and you cannot discard that. And I think many people realize that we actually were doing research, pointing in a certain direction that we couldn't any longer ignore. Good. And then I think also the inside and outside pressure helped, both the combination of internal stakeholders, colleagues, students, but also other actors in the Netherlands who were looking closely, and they were asking questions about, what's your pension fund doing? What about divestments? How are your buildings working? What's your entity? So really putting pressure in a bigger context helped us really to bridge that gap. And then finally, aligning values with this mission. So meaning that it was important to realize, someone's at the door at my place. I'm very sorry for that. Anyway, maybe you don't hear that. It's probably one of my kids. Aligning this with the core values of our university. So not trying to make this an issue in itself. It is about fossil fuel. It is about climate, but it needs to be aligned with, the values of the specific university you're talking about. And if you miss to do that, if you just sort of generally speak and say university should do this and that, I think that's much more difficult. So we try to really make that bridge and align that. And then finally, the last point I want to make is that we got really important support by our board. So by people in power that I agree with most of what Jennie said, but in this case, we're really very receptive to our arguments. I think because they were thinking of themselves as change makers. They are bounded change makers. It's difficult. And yes, they were sometimes arguing, I think we should engage, and can we be so bold? And they were scared, but they were also daring because they took this decision. And I'm very grateful to have worked with people who went out there and said, we take a responsibility and we are not shying away. And then others have to judge whether it was the right decision. But we're not hiding behind paragraphs and risk factors and I don't know what the law, and I don't know. They were really going out there and saying, we will do that as a community. There are many other things we learned, and I know my time is up, but I want to say it was a fantastic journey that we achieved together, but it's really just a small step. So I'm hopeful that things are moving. I'm a bit skeptical if they move fast enough, but this was, all in all, for me personally, a really good experience. Thank you very much. And I will open the door and then I'm back for questions.
Thank you so much, Philipp. Really appreciated that intervention. And it may seem like a small step to you, but me trying to imagine this happening at my university, it seems like such a monumental step. So great to hear, though, that you're not stopping there and that you're moving on to work on other things as well. Okay, I will turn it over now to our final speakers. Will and Maddie, take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kyla. And thank you, Jennie. I'm excited to read your book. And thank you, Philipp. The case at VU stands as one of the most inspirational cases we have for our movement and in Campus Climate Network. So super honored to be on this panel with you guys. Maddie and I will just talk a bit about Campus Climate Network, and I'm going to start here with talking about our history and actually go back nearly 5 decades. So in 1977, Hampshire College divested from South African apartheid as the first college in the United States to do so. This was the first big win for the student divestment movement. That same year, 1977, was also the year scientist James Black briefed ExxonMobil about the greenhouse effect. Nearly 35 years later, Hampshire College finally divested from ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel companies, also as the first college in the United States to do so. It took nearly 35 years because ExxonMobil had lied, denied, manipulated, and deceived the public about climate change and their own complicity in it. So when college students at Hampshire College and many other universities took to the streets, the hallways, the quads in the early 2010s, to demand fossil fuel divestment, it was not just because the fossil fuel industry was causing suffering all around the world. It was also very much because they lied to us about it. Many of these divestment calls were successful. Hundreds of institutions across the world are officially divested from fossil fuels, many institutions beyond just universities now. However, in recent years, students have realized that the universities support the fossil fuel industry not just with money, but with what universities are best at: knowledge, research, and education. Each year, fossil fuel companies pour millions and millions of dollars into universities in return for skewed research, commercial fossil fuel products, a social license to operate, as well as the education of the fossil fuel workforce. In short, fossil fuel companies are hijacking our universities to perpetuate their own toxic industry. And this is the issue Campus Climate Network first sprung out of. We started in 2022 as fossil-free research with an open letter calling for the halt of fossil fuel donations to climate research, signed by more than 1,000 top academics, scholars, and national politicians. Since then, we've grown to be a coalition of more than 40 campus climate groups using a variety of advocacy tools, including research, direct action, and trainings to hold our universities accountable, make them climate leaders, and kick big oil off our campuses. So with that, I'll pass on to Maddie to talk more specifically about the campaigns that we're working on now.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a bit about some of the different campaigns that students on all of the campuses of our 42 member groups are working on. So students are working on campaigns for their universities to divest from fossil fuels, to dissociate from the fossil fuel industry. So that can mean like not taking any funding for research or general operations, or not having the fossil fuel industry at career fairs. And then students are organizing for their universities to adopt Green New Deals, which generally includes a framework of university climate leadership through decarbonization, climate curriculum, environmental justice, and labor rights. So to kind of reference the name of this event, these are all ways that students are trying to reimagine their universities in ways that aren't, one, invested in climate catastrophe, ways that they aren't encumbered by the toxic influence of the fossil fuel industry, and then finally to really reimagine them as like climate justice leaders and universities that are fighting for Green New Deal values. So kind of using the framework that Jennie had talked about, which I really, really like. It's trying to like, one, resist corporate capture, and then to like reclaim and restructure our universities in these different ways. So then Will, if you want to talk about some of the work we've done recently.
Yes, so Maddie and I are the research managers at Campus Climate Network. So I think it's important that we talk about the research because this sort of frames the whole organization. We use our research to sort of inform our actions and our demands. It wouldn't make sense to protest fossil fuel presence on our campuses if we don't really know the extent and nature of this presence on our campuses. So Maddie and I do a wide variety of sort of research organizing and research to mobilize students and mobilize student researchers as well. Our most recent project is seen here. We collaborated with 6 campus climate groups across the United States. So Columbia University, American University, UC San Diego, Cornell University, Princeton University, and UNC Chapel Hill, wherein we sort of trained student researchers, student organizers on how to use accountability research tool, various research methods to expose fossil fuel influence on their respective campuses. So we just gave them these trainings, and then from those trainings, they produced these 6 reports that are really high quality. And I think you should all go read them. Some of the highlights from these reports are that across the 6 universities, we found more than $100 million from fossil fuel companies being donated to universities, which is a very low bound. This is sort of inherently a disclosure issue. We don't know how much money is actually flowing because fossil fuel companies are often trying to sort of hide this. But we know that we found at least $100 million across these 6 universities for fossil fuel companies. We found more than 1,500 articles were published by these universities that were sponsored by the fossil fuel industry. Articles that are harmful for a wide variety of reasons. Many of them push what we call false solutions or non-transformative solutions, fossil fuel-oriented solutions such as carbon capture or clean natural gas, those kinds of things. We found a lot of articles that focus explicitly on oil exploration and oil extraction research, basically universities explicitly giving the tools to fossil fuel companies that they need to perpetuate their industry and profit. And then we found some sort of unrelated articles, but articles that fossil fuel companies still donate to sort of polish their own social reputation by saying that they're donating to public good. We also found that Princeton owns a fossil fuel company, which is a sort of really weird, unique case where you're trying to research the influence of fossil fuel interest on universities, and you figure out that one of the university is itself a fossil fuel interest. We don't know the extent of that beyond Princeton, how many universities actually have their own fossil fuel companies, but that would be quite interesting to look into. We also found cases through FOIA requesting documents of universities building oil exploration products, explicitly mentioning for commercial use in their grant application, stuff like that. So there's quite a lot of stuff in there. There's a great Guardian article on it, but please go ahead and look at some of those reports. The student researchers did an amazing job at producing those. Additionally, in Campus Climate Network, we also collaborate closely with faculty on doing research and with various climate labs around the country, particularly the Climate Accountability Lab at University of Miami and the Climate and Development Lab at Brown. So if any faculty here is interested in doing more sort of student faculty value-based research, feel free to reach out. Yeah, and again, I think the importance of this research is that it serves the direct purpose of informing our actions and our demands. Yeah, and that I'll pass it on to Maddie to talk a little bit more about this faculty-student relationship.
Yeah, so now I'm going to talk a bit about the shared interest between students and faculty to achieve universities that center climate justice, and then how students and faculty can work together to achieve that, which I know many people here have probably been doing for many years. So I guess to start with shared interest, we know that we're all affected by the climate crisis. Obviously, there's inequality in who bears that burden disproportionately. And as members of universities that are also affected by this corporate co-option, we are all losing from that because less energy and resources are put into everything that universities should be, which is like curiosity, intellectual exploration, truth, and climate justice. Those things all suffer when our universities are co-opted by corporate interests. So as a result, we all want our institutions to take a role in preventing the climate crisis versus being complicit in it. And as Jennie just talked about, we know that our institutions play an important role in preventing the worst effects of the climate crisis that is already upon us. So one thing that connects to the kind of like VU University stuff and the fossil-free research commitment is like something that we think a lot about at Campus Climate Network is the ways that our universities are funded by the fossil fuel industry. So we know there's a whole university of ways that fossil fuel companies are connected with our universities, whether that be recruitment at career fairs or company executives being on university boards. But one specific example I want to talk a bit about is fossil fuel funding, because I think it offers a key area where students and faculty can be very powerful to come together and push back on fossil fuel industry influence. So kind of the student perspective on how faculty can be critical to climate justice campaigns on university campuses, particularly around this kind of pushback on fossil fuel funding, is first that faculty are often critical because they have knowledge and like institutional knowledge that students don't have, because there's that turnover every few years. And then faculty also have like power. And students have power as well. I think we all have power to push back on kind of the different ways in which like corporations have more power that comes with like wealth. But faculty sometimes have power when it relates to like being involved in governance processes, and obviously like shared governance processes at universities are often flawed and lacking. But despite that, faculty will often have more opportunities for formal participation in university decision-making structures that students won't have. And then the last way that will kind of get a little more into as well is that uniting between like students and faculty makes us much like stronger to accomplish our goals. So particularly when we're trying to push back on like fossil fuel funding, Will and I and many other students in our network experience that like the university administration will try and use like academic freedom or like the like needs and wants that they assign to faculty to push back on those like fossil-free research commitments and fossil-free funding commitments that we're fighting for. So yeah, I'll pass it to you, Will, to talk a little bit about Brown University and how you've collaborated with faculty there.
Yeah, so I guess I'll tell a story that's a little bit similar to Philipp's. I'm a student at Brown, so telling sort of the process we had at Brown to get a policy enacted, but paying particular attention to the collaborations, the activist collaborations between faculty and students. So on Earth Day 2022, Christina Paxson, president at Brown University, announced that the university would no longer do business with supporters of science disinformation, and updated the university business ethics policy. We believe this is one of the first, if not the first, policy of this kind, focusing particularly on disinformation supporters and sort of banning them on campus or not doing business with them. This policy came after intense pressure from two campus groups, one student group and one faculty group. The newly formed group, Students Against Coke Influence, had been writing an extensive research report on the Coke Foundation, the most infamous sort of climate deniers out there, but I would say, and their influence at Brown, and Students Against Coke Influence was protesting the opening of this new Coke-sponsored center at Brown. So there's sort of student pressure, diffuse student pressure against Coke influence on campus through the student organization. And meanwhile, scholars at Brown for Climate Action, which is a faculty-led group at Brown, have been writing a discussion paper encouraging Brown to cut ties with disinformation supporters such as Coke. So there was this diffuse pressure from two different groups that led to two formal pressure points on Brown's president. First is that there's a faculty-led committee on university research management that actually took this up formally and formally suggested or recommended to the president to adopt this no disinformation policy. And then second, there was a faculty body vote that voted 2-1 in favor of delaying the opening of the Coke-sponsored center until Brown had a formal business policy on climate misinformation. So these two formal pressure points basically put the president in a situation where she had no option but to update the business ethics policy to include the statement of not taking money or not doing business with disinformation supporters. So here, students and faculty really work together towards change. And there's a lot of pressure from students, but faculty played a key role in formalizing the pressure on enacting this institutional change through their vote in the faculty body, through their seats on the faculty committee, and through this faculty formed group, Scholars at Brown for Climate Action. But sadly, all good stories have an ending. This policy was enacted, but it was enacted with minimal instruction, minimal guidance on how to actually implement it. And there was no transparency afterwards on how it was being implemented. And as Philipp sort of mentioned here, there's quite a lot of questions around metrics and implementation on these policies. Like, for example, what is disinformation? How is it defined? What constitutes a disinformation supporter? What constitutes a business tie? All that kind of stuff. So the policy was basically left at multiple university committees that had no idea how to actually implement it, likely not being implemented at all. And if it is, we don't know how. So there's a lot of transparency issues here. So that's just to say that you know, we went one step forward, but we've kind of stalled since then, and we're now hoping again as students to lean on faculty to get sort of more like leverage their institutional power in these committees and their sort of bureaucratic or the institutional positions in the committees to actually implement the policy or update the policy so it's more implementable, or enact a whole new policy that is easier to implement. So that's what the picture you see here is our news campaign, inspired by the VU Amsterdam policy of rather than focusing on disinformation, we're focusing on fossil fuel ties or fossil fuel donations because they're easier to define, or would be a little easier to sort of like implement. But yeah, so a case of what went right and what we still need to do, but I think a strong case for faculty-student partnerships. So if there are any faculty on this call, you know, you can also consider this from Campus Climate Network as a hard ask to interact with your campus climate groups, with your campus justice groups, in collaborating them on some of these efforts. And I know some professors are in more privileged positions to do this than others. But if you have that extra energy, if you have that extra privilege to interact with student groups, it's hugely helpful to us when you contribute your institutional power, your institutional knowledge to us in enacting change.
Okay, this is our last slide. Sorry, I know we've gone a bit over. That was due to me and Will not coordinating well enough. So sorry about that. But I want to talk just a bit about action to close out our little section, which I would argue is, one of the most important parts of this whole thing is, we all understand that our universities can be climate leaders, and we all really have a role and a choice to make between, that climate isolationism, where, as students, we could just focus on earning a diploma, or maybe faculty just focus on like publishing or teaching, while the world is like unraveling around us into polycrisis, or we can join together and become united in this disciplined movement to make our universities take a stand for the world that we all deserve. A few ways that that can kind of happen is, one, through becoming co-conspirators with your students on your campus. So co-conspirators, I use that word just because it's not like a help or like support thing. It's like we have the shared interest, and we both win when our universities become climate leaders. So we want to take action on that together. And then the second way is there's also a faculty working group within Campus Climate Network, which you can join by emailing this email, and our next meeting for that is on October 30th. Yeah, and I just want to express a thank you again to everyone for organizing this, and I'm so glad that I got to hear from Philipp and Jennie. Those presentations were really great, and I feel like I learned a lot. So it's cool to see other people doing this work. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's perfectly fine that you went a bit over, because I was really hoping that the faculty student issue was going to be covered, and you've done that beautifully. Because another one of my motivations for this is to try to inspire people in the Earth System Governance Network to get more involved. And one thing that I come across sometimes is people pushing back, saying, oh, the administration doesn't listen to faculty, they're only going to listen to students. And I think both your presentation and Philipp's presentation really highlighted that it has to be a joint effort. There has to be a sort of community movement around that. So that's really exactly what I wanted to get out of this. So I really appreciate that. And I want to make sure we get through the questions that I've put in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do is just read them out. Some of them are specifically targeted to people, and some of them I think are open. And then we'll just go again in the order of the speakers to respond to whichever ones you feel are most relevant to you. So the first one is, what do you think of the term universitification or university? I don't know if Jennie or others are familiar with that term, but that's been proposed. Another one is, please elaborate on the synergies and differences between the climate justice movement and mainstream climate adaptation in higher education. Another one I think relates specifically to that mention in Jennie's presentation about the University of Grandmothers. It's about how we define local knowledge, and what if there is a conflict between sort of the knowledge that we accumulate through science and the way that grandparents might define their knowledge. For example, I think all of us have experiences perhaps with older relatives who would teach people things based on what they think are true, like, oh, actually winters are no different than in my childhood, climate change is not real, and so forth. So how do we ensure that actually that local knowledge is getting presented is actually, I think, relevant to the kind of climate justice advocacy that we're hoping for? Sort of whether we can actually present that knowledge as being equal to scientific knowledge in the university context. Another question I think we've kind of addressed, but I'm happy for other people to reflect on this as well, is that, again, we know that students are often the most daring, the most willing to demand change. getting into encampments and so forth, and going out in big protests. But they do also leave a university after 3 to 4 years. So how do we promote that continuity of student efforts? Obviously, faculty plays a role, as we've talked about a bit, but are there other things that we can do to ensure that the kind of knowledge developed by campus activists don't disappear after the time that they're there? For Maddie and Will specifically, would you recommend that PhD students get involved as faculty or as students? And the comment there also, thanks for all your action. And the final one, thank you for this excellent conversation. Just please put some of the links and email addresses in the chat. So if you want to put it, there's such an impressive amount of research being done in the Campus Climate Network. I'm amazed at all that work that's been done. So it'd be great to have links in the chat for that. But perhaps I can turn it over to Jennie and any of those questions that you want to address.
Sure, great. And thank you. Thanks to Philip and Will and Maddie as well. I guess I can quickly just kind of go through the list. The universityfication term, I think it's used in many different contexts and to mean different things, but I'm most familiar with how Davarian Baldwin uses it in the critical university studies area of kind of showing how universities are kind of taking over as powerful actors in urban governance. So I think that's a risk and a challenge with some of the concentration of wealth and power of these universities that are getting really powerful in some of these cities. And again, kind of putting the university's interests ahead of the public good is how I would interpret it. The question about climate justice versus mainstream climate adaptation or mitigation in higher ed. So this is a really important question. And I think the way I'd like to think about it is the focus on decarbonization and greenhouse gas emission reductions and thinking about the climate as the problem that needs to be solved is kind of proving to be both ineffective and insufficient. So when we broaden and think about a climate justice lens, we think of the climate crisis as just a symptom of a bigger problem, right? The climate isn't the thing that needs to be fixed. It is our structures and systems of economics and politics and social and cultural things that are perpetuating not just the climate crisis, but these other crises as well. So I think that's, for me, the biggest shift. So I think in higher ed, this gets challenging, right? Because, as you said, the mainstream climate actions that higher education can take are trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions just like any other organization or city. And it's not to say those aren't important. Those are important as well. But the real focus is to try to get to more transformative things, not just reductions in emissions. So I think it's really a transformative lens, a paradigm shift is what the climate justice movement is. And a lot of the higher ed climate action is not that. So I think that's the distinction. But I know it's challenging to implement because higher education is an organization that's comfortable with siloing and kind of narrowing and zooming in on something rather than looking at it holistically. Finally, I'll just quickly speak to the local knowledge question. For me, what is a good example of the danger of only prioritizing what we consider kind of scientific knowledge is like this big push for geoengineering and all the science and geoengineering. There's all these models that scientists are producing that show that they can inject sulfate aerosols into the atmosphere and cool the earth. And the science keeps getting better and better, saying how it's actually could be done, no problem, like all this. But what I think is the biggest risk is that when we just look at from scientific perspective, not looking at it with local knowledge or indigenous knowledge or feminist perspective or, perspective of understanding like power dynamics and how things work, where we get stuck focusing on these solutions that I think you know, are actually quite dangerous. So I guess it's a balance. It's not saying there's one kind of knowledge is superior to another. It's like the acknowledging of the plurality of knowledge and different kinds of knowledge and different people. Everyone has some value in whatever their knowledge system and their experiences. So universities are just, you know, set up to be this elitist kind of prioritizing certain kinds of expert knowledge and dismissing and you know, not prioritizing other kinds of knowledge. So I think we can move back. There's a need to move back, especially with the ecological crises, and we've lost touch with, you know, how our own survival is contingent on ecological health, right? Yet we continue to cause ecological decline. So I think this lack of this kind of narrow way of thinking of Western science as like dominant and has really not served us well. So we need to like expand the kind of knowledge. So I think that was my main point there. And I'll hand it over to the others to respond.
Yeah, so if we go in the order, then I take this now. Just really cool discussion. Actually, really also learned a lot. Thanks, everyone. I just have a short comment on the knowledge question. Fascinating about this universal grandmother idea. I think that's really something to think about. In general, of course, the idea to honor traditions and wisdom instead of knowledge is or you know, the scientific type of knowledge we think is a good way to think and to reflect that. I think the issue is not so much with where the knowledge is, so it's like ideas local knowledge versus as if there were global knowledge. What is that? I think the problem is with the type of knowledge that is reductionist in a sense. We know a lot about individual things, so we know about different plants, so to speak, but you don't know how they grow together in a garden, but a gardener knows that. And you can ask a university biology professor, they have no clue. They just study all of the things in isolation. So I think that's a bit where the problem is. Good. Now the question I want to answer is the one about the students and the role and the observation that they come and go, which is true. So one way to think about that is to institutionalize, in a way, a voice for the students, and that is partially done in terms of how universities are run in some systems where there's student representation. But the other is something that we observe a lot in Europe, and that's the green office movement. So that's basically saying that students found an institution called the Green Office, which is sort of a nucleus of change, of transformation within the university run by students. That's everything from thinking about campus-oriented change projects about waste and biodiversity and whatever. It's about education. It's like telling new incoming students what exists, but it's also putting pressure on researchers, asking them for help and so on. So it's basically trying to have a motor in the university, which isn't the administration itself, but it's the students. But it's not the students as an uncoordinated sort of amorphous body, but gives them a room, gives them support, gives them standing, gives them funding. So it's sort of a trick. Although those students will change over as well. If you found an institution, you can keep some of that knowledge and you can give it to the next generation. I think that has worked very nicely here in the Netherlands and other European countries, as I know about, where green offices have been really part and parcel of that change. And then one final point about the performative versus transformative problem. So a lot of climate policy is performative, and very few, none is transformative at this stage. I think the frontier that we're really trying to push against is indeed the education itself. So the mental frames, the knowledges that we actually have at the university. And that's a much bigger fish to fry than just saying we don't work with Shell, because we probably didn't do that as much anyway, but to really challenge. And it's across the disciplines, old-fashioned ways of thinking about what, and we just discussed it, what science actually is so deep, it's very confrontational, that I think that will take longer. But I do see good discussions on that as well, where we try to start with little steps. You know, let's have an introductory course on the climate breakdown, whatever you have, on the triple crisis, on the polycrisis, right in the first year of the bachelor. And this is becoming ever more accepted that we should do it. I'm not saying everyone is doing it, but these are little steps to really change the curriculum and eventually also education itself, right? So pedagogy is changing. There is a lot about sort of green pedagogy out there, but it's marginalized. But I see that this altogether, right, is moving in the right direction. I think that's really important to realize. These are not independent struggles. This is one big struggle. So to connect them and to connect the players and help them realize that connection will empower. So that's my 2 cents on that. Thanks. Really great, everyone.
I can jump on the question about how PhD students can get involved. And I think the answer is almost in the question itself. The question goes as faculty or as students, and I think that's where PhD students like have a really unique position that they can do both. They can be sort of the connecting link between the student body and the faculty body. And I know from personal experience and from talking to people that PhD students are really valued in student organizing in student groups. So for PhD students, I think it's totally okay to show up to your campus climate group and contribute there, and also show up obviously to your faculty meetings and stuff, and sort of bring some of the thoughts from the groups there. So you can leverage both some of your institutional power. You might have knowledge around the funding structure of your department. You might even sit on a committee or teach a class. You might have more connections to faculty than students have. You might have like some fundraising capacity, like sort of utilizing all that institutional power, and then connecting it with your campus climate, your student group, and then sort of connecting the demands and the actions and the thoughts of the student group back up to the institution. So sort of like PhD students are really valued, sort of taking that space in between faculty and students.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing onto that is that, yeah, PhD students are usually at universities for longer periods of time than undergraduate students. So there's kind of some power that comes there, because you can like be this bridge across like different generations of undergraduate students and like build up some more institutional knowledge. And then also you might be part of a graduate union, which actually can bring you like more power in different ways to advocate for like climate justice policies, like through your union as well. So I would promote those 2 things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, all of you. I would just add as well that to the idea of keeping, I think this Green Office's idea of keeping the institutional knowledge is great, but I would also add that we've got now this Climate Justice Universities Union, we've got the Campus Climate Network, and this is a great way to kind of institutionalize and share a lot of that knowledge across experiences. And I'm really excited about that because, you know, it can be difficult if you're at a university where there's not a lot happening to get, you know, it's kind of that energy from other people. And that's what this session has really given me, a lot of energy and a lot of excitement. I'm going to read Jennie's book. I'm going to read some more reports from the student researchers, and I'm excited to see what we can do with all of that. This session has been recorded, so please do feel free to share it with other people who you want to inspire to get more involved. We are out of time, but I just want to thank all of you so much again. This was a really fantastic session for me. I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed it as well, and thank you so much for your questions. Yes, awesome. And go out there and do great things on your campuses. Let's make some change. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyla.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.